Hi, I'm Mr. Wahlberg, and I'm glad you're here. The impact of World War II on the United States is hard to explain exactly how much it changed our country, but also how much it changed Europe. Turn with us now to those thrilling days of yesteryear, when out of the past come the thundering hoofbeats of Wahlberg's A-Push. History class rides again! We have two objectives today. By the end of this class, you should be able to analyze the ways in which American minorities faced threats at home and abroad, and you should be able to summarize the sequence of events that ended the war in Europe. But let's begin in Roman numeral number 17. Here I want to talk about what is sometimes called the American dilemma and begin with the question of patriotic assimilation. Because World War II created a vast melting pot, especially for European immigrants and their children, as millions moved out of ethnic neighborhoods and isolated rural towns to go find work in the new wartime industry. The ethnic discrimination of the 1920s, so typical of the World War I era, became less acceptable in an era familiar with Hitler's racial ideology. Still, sharp divisions reigned between the races, which brings us to subpoint B of Mexican Americans. In 1942, the United States initiated the Bracero program, which allowed tens of thousands of contract laborers to cross into the United States, taking up jobs as domestic and agricultural workers. They weren't U.S. citizens, and there was no path to becoming one. They had difficulty finding decent housing and decent wages, and their temporary status prevented migrant workers from organizing any real labor unions to change that lot in life. Los Angeles had the highest population of people of Mexican descent outside of Mexico City, and the city also had a record for discrimination in housing and education and recreation. For instance, swimming pools were only open to African American and Mexican American children or adults one day a week, and then after that day, the pools were drained, cleaned, refilled, and reopened for white people, so they wouldn't have to swim in the same water that persons of color did. Particularly in Los Angeles, a young Mexican man rebelled against tradition, often wearing what was known as a zoot suit. A zoot suit was a particular style of clothing with long jackets and wide pleated pegged pants. A number of sailors in Los Angeles targeted the young men who were wearing zoot suits, triggering violence between thousands of servicemen and civilians. Mobs poured into Mexican American neighborhoods, grabbed anybody in a zoot suit, and basically beat the snot out of them. The zoot suit riots lasted a week with hundreds of injuries to Mexican Americans. Subpoint C. Here I want to pick up the story on Native Americans, which we haven't significantly discussed for a while in AP US history, but here we re-enter the story with Native Americans because around 25,000 Native Americans served in the Army, most famous of which were the Navajo code talkers, who transmitted messages in their own language, which was entirely undecipherable to the Japanese. Insisting that the United States couldn't draft Indian men, the Iroquois nation issued their own declaration of war against the Axis powers. War production jobs off the reservation, though, meant that many Native Americans had, for the first time, a real chance to enter mainstream society, and many never returned to the reservations after the war. Subpoint D. Probably like the biggest story of civil rights in the World War II era is the question of for Japanese Americans. The American government viewed essentially every person who was of Japanese descent as a potential spy for the Japanese Empire. The military persuaded Roosevelt to issue Executive Order 9066, which allowed the Secretary of War to declare certain zones as military zones and permitting internment camps for potential enemies. Other than people of Japanese descent, hardly anybody spoke out against the internments. The courts refused to intervene, with the Supreme Court even declaring them legal in the case Korematsu versus United States. The government, though, had no problem selling war bonds to internees or even drafting them into the Army. Subpoint E. Here I want to talk about African Americans in the war, because mass migrations of African Americans stirred new racial tensions in overcrowded northern cities. Those mass migrations meant construction of new housing projects, often in white neighborhoods. In 1943, racial violence erupted across the country, but particularly in the city of Detroit, where a small fight between a handful of white and black people grew into a riot when white sailors joined in the fight. False rumors that white people murdered an African American woman and child and black rioters killed 17 white people. It led to a 3-day riot with 34 people either injured or dead. Detroit also had a 20,000 person hate strike protesting against black workers in an aircraft engine factory who had their positions upgraded. During the war, 1 million black Americans served in the armed forces. In the Army, they served in segregated units. In the Navy, they served only as waiters or cooks. There are reports of black soldiers sometimes even had to give up their seats in railroad cars to Nazi prisoners of war. Roman numeral 18. As the Allies were battling for Italy in 1943, they had begun work on a dramatic plan to invade France and Western Europe from the Nazis. The task of commanding Operation Overlord, as it was called, fell to American General Dwight D. Eisenhower, also known as Ike. Under Eisenhower's direction in England, the Allies gathered a force of nearly 3 million British, American, and Canadian troops, together with mountains of military equipment and supplies. Eisenhower planned to attack Normandy and northern France, but to keep their plans secret, the Allies set up a huge phantom army with its own pretend headquarters and its own pretend equipment. In radio messages they knew that the Germans could read, Allied commanders sent orders to make this make-believe army to go attack the French port of Calais, 150 miles away, where the English Channel was narrowest and a pretty good spot for an invasion. As a result, Hitler ordered his generals to keep a large army at Calais to prepare for this, what turned out to be a fictitious invasion from the Allied troops. Operation Overlord was originally set for June 5th, but bad weather forced a delay. Banking on a forecast for clearing skies, Eisenhower gave the go-ahead for D-Day, June 6th of 1944, on the first day of the invasion. D-Day means nothing. The D doesn't stand for anything. It was just a letter to signify the day. Shortly after midnight, 3 divisions parachuted down behind German lines, and they were followed in the early morning hours by thousands upon thousands of seaborne soldiers, the largest land, sea, air operation in Army history. Despite the massive air and sea bombardment by the Allies, the German retaliation was brutal, particularly at the toughest sea, that of Omaha Beach. The Allies gained ground in Subpoint B because despite heavy casualties, the Allies held the beachheads. Within 7 days of fighting, the Allies held an 80-mile strip in northern France, and within a month, they had landed 1 million troops, 567,000 tons of supplies, and 170,000 vehicles onto the shores of France. On July 25th, General Omar Bradley unleashed a massive air-land bombardment against the enemy at Saint-Lô, which provided a gap in the German line of defense, through which General George Patton and his Third Army could advance. On August 23rd, Patton and the Third Army reached all the way to the Seine River south of Paris. 2 days later, the French resistance forces and the American troops liberated the French capital from 4 years of German occupation. By September of 1944, the Allies had freed France and Belgium and Luxembourg, and this good news and the American people's desire not to change horses midstream helped elect Franklin Roosevelt to a yet another unprecedented term, this one his 4th successful election as president in November, along with his brand new running mate, welcome to the storyline, Harry S. Truman. Subpoint C. In October of 1944, Americans captured their first German town, known as Aachen. Hitler responded with a desperate last-gasp offensive. He ordered his troops to break through the Allied lines and to recapture the Belgian port city of Antwerp. In this bold move, the Fuhrer hoped they would disrupt the enemy's supply line and demoralize the Allies. On December 16th, under the cover of dense fog, 8 German tank divisions broke through weak American defenses along an 80-mile front. Hitler hoped that a victory would split American and British forces and break up the Allied supply lines. Tanks drove nearly 60 miles into Allied territory, creating a bulge in the lines that gave the name to this desperate last German offensive, the Battle of the Bulge. As the Germans swept eastward, they captured 120 American GIs near Malmedy. Elite German troops, the SS troopers, herded prisoners into a large battlefield and mowed them down with machine guns and pistols. Battle raged for a month. When it was over, the Germans had been pushed back, and frankly, very little seemed to have changed. But in fact, events had taken a decisive turn. The Germans had lost 120,000 troops and 600 tanks and assault guns and 1,600 planes in the Battle of the Bulge, and that was more weapons and soldiers than they could replace. From that point on, all the Nazis had to do was retreat. Subpoint D. Meanwhile, Allied troops pressed eastward into the German heartland, and the Soviet army pushed westward across Poland and Berlin. Soviet troops were the first to come across the Nazi death camps in July of 1944. As the Soviets drew near a camp called Majdanek in Poland, SS guards worked feverishly to burn and bury all evidence of the hideous crimes. But they ran out of time. When the Soviets entered Majdanek, they found 1,000 starving prisoners, barely alive, the world's largest crematorium, and a storehouse containing 800,000 shoes. The Americans who later liberated the Nazi death camps in Germany were equally horrified. Subpoint E. In February of 1945, the Allies pushed towards victory in Europe, and an ailing Roosevelt met with Churchill and Stalin in the Black Sea resort city of Yalta, deep into the Soviet Union. Stalin graciously welcomed the president and the prime minister, and the Big Three, as they called, toasted the defeat of Germany, which seemed now all but certain. For 8 days, the three leaders discussed the fate of Germany in the post-war world. Stalin, his country devastated by German forces, favored a harsh approach. He wanted to keep Germany divided into occupation zones, areas controlled by Allied military forces, so that Germany would never again threaten the Soviet Union. Churchill strongly disagreed, and Roosevelt sat in the middle and acted as a mediator. Roosevelt was prepared to make certain concessions to Stalin for 2 reasons. First, he hoped that the Soviet Union would stand by its commitments to go join the war against Japan that was still waging in the Pacific. The first test of the atom bomb was still 5 months away, and Roosevelt knew he had a long battle ahead of him. Secondly, Roosevelt wanted Stalin's support for a new world peacekeeping organization to be named the United Nations. The historic meeting at Yalta produced a series of compromises. To pacify Stalin, Roosevelt convinced Churchill to agree to a temporary division of Germany into 4 zones, one each for the Americans, the British, the Soviets, and the French. Churchill and Roosevelt assumed that in time, all the zones would be brought together for a reunited Germany. For his part, Stalin promised free and unfettered elections in Poland after the Soviet-occupied Eastern European countries. So basically, as these countries are becoming, free again, that Stalin wouldn't go try to push them into a further Soviet state. Stalin also agreed to go join the war in Japan. The struggle was expected to continue for at least another year or more. In addition, he agreed to participate in the international conference to take place in April in San Francisco, and there Roosevelt's dream of a United Nations could become a reality. Subpoint F. By April 25, 1945, the Soviet army had stormed Berlin. As Soviet shells burst overhead, the city panicked. In his underground headquarters in Berlin, Hitler prepared for the end. On April 29th, he married Eva Braun, his longtime girlfriend. That same day, he wrote out his last address to the German people. In this last address, the last things he left for the country, he blamed the Jews for starting the war. He blamed his generals for losing it. He writes, "I die with a happy heart, aware of the immeasurable deeds of our soldiers at the front. I, myself, and my wife choose to die in order to escape the disgrace of capitulation." The next day, Hitler shot himself, and his new wife swallowed poison. In accordance with Hitler's orders, the 2 bodies were carried outside, soaked with gasoline, and burned. A week later, General Eisenhower accepted the surrender of the Third Reich. On May 8, 1945, the Allies celebrated VE Day, Victory in Europe Day. The war in Europe was over. Subpoint G. President Roosevelt didn't live to see VE Day. On April 12, 1945, while posing for a portrait in Warm Springs, Georgia, the president had a stroke and died. It was just days before Mussolini was captured and Hitler committed suicide and the war in Europe ended. That night, Vice President Harry Truman became the nation's 33rd president. Truman had only been vice president for 85 days when Roosevelt died, and he wasn't particularly close to Roosevelt or involved in wartime decision-making. Nevertheless, Truman's leadership would help us fight through the rest of the war and set up the peacetime situations that would follow it. This transition in presidents is also a transition not only in leadership but also in vision, with it turns out to be a fascinating story that I can't wait to tell you about. Make sure you like and subscribe. God bless you.